Good evening, everybody. I'm going to echo the sentiments, although I'd be a little more blunt about it. It sucks not being in person. I know we're all over this Zoom thing, and I will tell you, I think we're just about done. So I am very excited to see you next year. But in the meantime, we have a few things to talk about, and that's what I'm here for, to give you some sense of things. A lot to talk about. I want to get through things relatively quickly. I always know we always have some good questions at the end of these things. But to start, we need a little bit of history. I'm going to go back to about 18 months ago. I discussed this with you last year. You remember the miserableism, the craziness. 30 to 40 million people are going to be evicted. Home prices are going to fall any second now. 30% of people are not going to pay their mortgages, so on and so forth. We discussed this U versus V debate. I went through our version and why I thought most of this ridiculous. And I would say, here we are in third quarter 2021, and it turns out it was indeed miserableism. This stuff didn't come true. Now, it doesn't mean, of course, that things aren't very interesting. They are. Look, here's the upshot. I guys always have too many slides, but let me just kind of give you the big picture, and we'll go from there. One, as I told you last year, as tragic as this was as a natural disaster type situation, obviously we have to feel for the millions of families who've lost loved ones, continue to in many ways. But putting that to one side, natural disasters do not have long-run economic consequences. This was not an economic crisis, it was a health crisis. But they turned it into an economic crisis. And as a result of that, you put in the politics of the day, and we saw one of the most preposterous overreactions on the part of our Congress and the Federal Reserve. They have put so much money into this economy. And to be clear, it's going to be fun. This economy's on rocket boosters. It's going to be there for a while. But look, these stimulus efforts have costs. There are consequences that we're completely ignoring. And that, of course, is going to be a big part of the conversation over the next few years. What are the consequences of this overreaction? Now, with that in mind, things don't feel the same. I mean, I just told you the economy's taken off, everything's great. Feels weird. Well, it does. It's a very unbalanced recovery. In as much as how this pandemic has influenced things has created a situation by which the structure of economic demand right now is different than it was 2 years ago. And the economy is just having trouble keeping up, to be honest with you. But it is a supply constraint, not necessarily a demand one. Much of these day-to-day crises are nonsensical. I point out probably the most strongest indicator of this comment is very clear. Look, from 2019 to 2020, we just got the data, the poverty rate fell. So for all the chaos that occurred last year, poverty rates were down, not up. And what I'm trying to get across here is, look, there are people in poverty. We need to help those folks. But if we're talking about the economy in the aggregate, the reality is things are better now than they were 2 years ago in a lot of different ways. Now, again, with the cost of what's going on at the federal level in terms of these policies. But all these COVID-related situations, no, they don't really exist. Again, the economy looks remarkably strong. New normals don't exist. Pandemics have been with humanity since we made our first town. It's ridiculous to think that humanity is going to suddenly change permanently on the basis of something that's been occurring all along, but it has absolutely accelerated underlying trends in the economy. Probably the most important one is labor shortages, because this has been part of our conversation for years, but now it happened. And it's something we all have to think about. And as for real estate, yeah, it's kooky, but the reality is, at least for now, it's sustainable. Everybody's looking at real estate and saying, well, is this the new bubble? Is this what we got to worry about? No, real estate's fine. This is not 2006. The risks in 2006 were driven by an out of control subprime lending market. and all the problems that it created for the private sector. Today, the private sector fundamentally looks pretty damn good, but it's not because there aren't risks. The risks we are seeing today are risks that are coming from the public sector. So there's a lot of risk out there, but it's coming from a different kind of place, from a different kind of direction. And candidly, you got to watch in a slightly different way. So with all that in mind, why wasn't it depression we were told it was going to be? Well, again, and back in 2006, look, the growth was good, but the economy was a disaster. It was overheated by subprime lending, and all the fundamentals were a mess. This thing came and hit an economy that, it was slightly slower growing, but really the fundamentals were fantastic. That was a big part of our conversation in 2017, 2018, and 2019. It was a fundamentally very strong economy, one that could handle a shock. The kind of recession back then, all the wealth disappeared, all the debt was real, and Americans spent years trying to rebuild their savings, because we all have to have savings for retirement and all the other kind of stuff. In other words, yes, there were specific problems in housing and consumer finance, but really the entire economy was suffering because people were spending less as they tried to rebuild things. This time around, it wasn't a general economy situation. It was a supply shock. And the difference, the way to think of the difference is this. In 2010, people didn't go to restaurants because they couldn't afford to. In 2020, they didn't go to restaurants because they weren't allowed to. Now, the reason that's different is if you aren't allowed to go to restaurants, well, hey, we're good Americans. I'm going to find a way to spend my money anyway. So I will go buy bicycles and hot tubs and automobiles and everything else. The problems in a certain part of our economy were offset at some level by excess in other parts of the economy, which again on net meant this just wasn't that big of a shock to the economy. Back then, inadequate government response, this time excessive. That time, it was a 9-year full cycle till recovery, longest business cycle in the post-World War II period. It was a tough round. And this time it's been 1 year, and the economy is now in the process of overheating. What's interesting is how little the political rhetoric has changed from 2011 to 2021, despite the palpable differences in terms of the business cycle we just went through. Now, that was a big mouthful. Let's get into it and talk about what's actually going on out there. For example, we got the numbers this morning, 2% growth, aggregate demand only grew 1%. You're already hearing the hand wringing, oh my God, the recovery's slowing down. Well, look, take a look on the right-hand side. This is final demand relative to trend and gross domestic product relative to trend. One of the reasons that the recovery may be slowing down is, by the way, we've recovered. Look at spending. Aggregate spending by businesses, consumers, and the government is already back to where it was pre-pandemic. Now, output is having a tough time keeping up. That's still a couple percent below where it was, but it's not a consumption problem. Consumers are right back to where we were. The economy has fully recovered. But the reason GDP is slowing down is not demand, it's because supply is having a big problem keeping up with demand. Take a look at the left-hand side. This is trends in consumer spending by sector. The services are still a few percent behind where they were pre-pandemic relative to trend. And restaurants are still trying to get up to capacity. Global tourism still isn't back. But all this money that wasn't spent in those sectors got spent elsewhere, particularly in buying stuff. Anybody tried to buy a bicycle or a hot tub in the last year, or a camper or a boat, knows exactly what I'm talking about. The kind of trends in spending, particularly for durables, was so far above normal, and it hit an economy with very thin excess capacity, and indeed an economy that a lot of these business folks said, yeah, maybe this depression is real. And by the way, the kind of unevenness of the recovery isn't just apparent, if you will, in terms of the spending pattern, it's also regionally. You look in, for example, the inland parts of the state, they're doing fine. But places like San Francisco, LA, or San Diego, who rely on a lot of fly-in tourism, well, they're having a tough time. Their jobs are way down. You see it in the taxable sales numbers as well. The places that have the warehouses are making money hand over fist. The places that, again, are relying on that tourism having a tough time. Industrial production has come roaring back along with that excess of goods demand. You can see the numbers: motor vehicles, primary metals, computers, electronic products. We're back. I mean, again, manufacturing's out of the hole. Their problem is they just can't keep up. You look at unfilled orders. Look how non-defense capital goods are just going up quite sharply. Take a look on the right-hand side. This is inventory to sales ratios for retail in the US. And no, your eyes do not deceive you. We've never seen inventory to sales ratios this low. If demand returned to normal tomorrow, and by the way, it won't, but if it would still take a year for these retailers just to kind of restock relative to where they want to be relative to sales. So yeah, we got a lot of momentum in this economy because of all this money. You can see it in imports. Imports are up, through the roof, all the way across the board. The customs district's giant numbers. You can't get stuff in fast enough. Boats are parked outside. Container costs are up to $10,000 for a 40-foot container. That's 6.5 times what it was a couple of years ago. Now, not everybody's paying this. What's happening is some folks are so desperate to get their stuff and they're willing to pay $20,000, $25,000 to get it in, while everybody else sits on boats outside the ports. Now, we're trying to catch up. You would have thought that 2 months ago when this was happening, they would have, I don't know, run 2-3 shifts. Apparently, it takes an order of the president to get the longshoremen to do a couple extra hours a day, but they're trying to catch up. But the damage is done. One of the interesting things about this cycle, the last cycle behind us, the expansion, was, it was a moderate cycle. It was kind of slow, 2.5%, nothing got too exciting. And one of the reasons for that, it was a very unusual expansion in as much as you didn't see a giant increase in capacity. For example, in a typical expansion, shippers always get ahead of themselves. We need lots of new container boats. And then when things start to slow down, we end up with excess capacity. Never happened this time. Even the automakers, very interesting cycle. Look on the right-hand side. This is domestic auto inventories. And look how auto inventories were falling long before the pandemic became an issue. A very conservative approach, a just-in-time approach. Now, again, in the short run, it helps profits, but demand's taken off and they can't handle it, right? And it's not just that you can't get enough cars produced because you don't have any inventories. You can't catch up on the number of cars you need to produce just to keep inventory stable because you're so tight in terms of your capacity and your parts. And then, of course, you're trying to get more stuff in from overseas and there's not enough boats and it all starts cascading. And, again, pity the poor auto industry. Auto sales in the US have fallen by a third, 33% in the last 4 or 5 months. Now, if you told me that auto sales had fallen by a third over a 6-month period, I would tell you we were in a recession, not an expansion, not a recovery. But of course, again, it's a supply chain problem. They can't sell them. We know that. Just look at the price of used cars, up 25% year over year, because there is nothing to buy out there. So it's an interesting kind of economy. We see business investment is back. Profits are back. And by the way, if you're thinking about San Jose, San Francisco, look what's top of the list. Information processing equipment and software are up strongly. These are real numbers year over year. I haven't gotten Q3 in yet. Great numbers, right? Lots of new investment. Profits are up. They took a 1 quarter hit for the last year. Corporate profits have been the highest they've ever been. I always find it funny whenever they assign a decline in the stock market to the COVID situation. Oh, the Delta wave is worrying world equity markets. And as a result, equity prices fell. In the worst surge of the virus last fall, corporate profits were the highest they've ever been. Why would the market be afraid of another surge in the virus? But again, it's amazing how the kind of these public conversations we see in the press are so disconnected from even basic economic realities. Venture capital was an enormous year last year. These are US investments overall were through the roof. Investments in San Jose were through the roof. California continues to eat up, 65, 70%. We keep hearing how Austin is eating our lunch. Not quite. Tech employment didn't budge through this. Good solid numbers for the region right into end of last year, up in the beginning of this year. Another big surprise, housing markets. Remember, I was told prices were going to fall, and then the market just exploded last year. Existing home sales were up, new home sales were up. Um, Prices through the roof. Look at these numbers. Year over year, prices are up 20%. In places like San Francisco, in Phoenix, these are Case-Shiller numbers. You're talking 20% plus increases in home prices. Unbelievable. San Jose, median price is now up to a 1.4 million. You remember a year and a half ago when you guys were amazed by 1.2 million? That's not 1.4. And sales are through the roof. No one's even blinking an eye. Why? Well, it has a lot to do with what wasn't happening in the housing market 2 years ago. I remember coming up and we were talking about, people were talking about a recession going to happen because of the Chinese trade war and the real estate collapse. Now, real estate was really cold. There's no doubt about it. But, you know, what was happening was a couple things. Interest rates had come up. We had the changes in tax policy. And we had a lot of conversation about how the housing markets weren't doing well. And then it results, things got cold. People weren't in a rush to jump into the market. Hey, why not wait? We'll find the perfect house, or we'll wait for prices to fall, better yet. But as I noted back then, the fundamentals of the market were just fine. And actually inventories were quite tight. Now, you jump into the pandemic, interest rates come plummeting because of Federal Reserve policy. People are stuck in their homes. Now they're thinking about buying a new home. We'll come back to the income and the saving situation in a second. What a glorious time to buy. People went out to buy and there's nothing available. Well, of course, when there's nothing available, you go from everybody taking their time to everybody panicking about being able to buy a home. Stories of 50, 60 offers coming in on one home were the real deal. Now, the market's cooled off a bit, right? Inventories of new homes are coming up just a bit. Existing homes still very, very tight. Residential permits are cooling off. The market's still very tight because there's a lot of movement trying to get into home ownership. It's really the bottom line. But the top end is kind of cooling a bit, which is good news. I think the market's being reasonable. Is it a bubble? No, for all the reasons I told you last year and the year before that. For example, over the last decade, the mortgage market, 4% growth per year in mortgages, a very conservative lending market. The quality of borrowers insane. Over the last year, 85% of borrowers have FICO scores over 720. And even the cost of housing. Take a look on the right-hand side. This is data from 2011 to 2019. Look at California. In 2011, 40% of homeowners, almost 40% of homeowners in the state were housing cost constrained. They used over 35% of their income to support the cost of their house. That's tough. That's a real burden. Now, we all know what happened to home prices in California from 2011 to 2019. They went up 50, 60%. It went through the roof. Look what happened in terms of the number of mortgage cost constrained households. It fell to 28%. We keep being told we have an affordability crisis. We don't have affordability crisis, inasmuch as the people buying homes in California can afford them. The prices you see in California reflect the incomes of the people buying them. For them, this is not a problem. What we have in California is a supply crisis, and we don't have enough inventory. Yet again, the inventory question, of course, the price reflects the fact that only the richest people get to buy homes. If you want home prices to be more affordable in this state, you have to have more homes. That's the only solution, and it's the one Sacramento and candidly San Mateo and Los Gatos all are having a problem with, is the basic idea that you got to build more homes. Rental markets are coming back. Of course they were going to. We keep hearing any minute now, all those evictions are about to take place. You know, the ones that never took place. Gavin Newsom can't figure out why his fund to pay back rent hasn't been used up yet, because again, the problems were never that severe. Now, the rental markets are kind of steadying. You can see asking rents, which took a big dive, more of a absorption problem than an economic problem. Things are stabilizing, vacancy rates nice and normal. And I just pointed out, look, median rents, even median rents as a percent of income have been falling in the state. Rent to income ratios in San Francisco were some of the lowest in the state, despite the fact that it has the highest rents. And by the way, for lower income families, their incomes, their spending has come back because of all the support, the fact they haven't done all that poorly. It just was never a crisis that was never going to happen. And it's interesting, we still talk about it. But again, reality is something different. Non-residential, well, permits are down. There's no doubt about it. There's a lot of uncertainty out there, but there's not a tremendous amount of problems. Interesting, vacancy rates in office, that's what's really come up. Retail's been remarkably steady. Of course, industrial is kind of the golden child. But what's interesting is the crisis that didn't happen. Look at commercial real estate loan delinquencies. Didn't budge. Lending markets, it's just as easy to borrow money for commercial real estate as it was 2 years ago. And senior loan officer survey says it's fine. Overall growth in lending, just about the same. There's no problems. There were no issues because, again, this was never a financial crisis, but it's accelerating underlying trends. And what were those trends? Well, here's a couple of them. On the left-hand side, this is real investment in structures in the U.S. And it's interesting because what it says is, well, multi-merchandise shopping was going down. Of course it was. People were buying stuff on the internet. We didn't need retail space. Industrial has been, again, the golden child because Amazon can't build enough of the damn things. Healthcare, nice and steady. One of the big surprises on this, for me at least, was office space. Big boom in spending on office, despite the fact that national vacancy rates never really got all that low. In a place like San Francisco, for example, of course, this had a lot to do with what I would call more about office demand than office supply. And the reality was, particularly in a lot of these dense centers, if you wanted the best and brightest, you wanted the best venture capital, you wanted the coolest, clients, you had to have the best building. And a lot of new buildings went up just to meet that new demand. And a lot of the older, particularly suburban buildings, were emptying out. Now, again, not a tremendous change in things, but what does it all mean, right? Where is this thing going? Well, take retail. Retail has actually been pretty steady, but keep in mind, e-commerce got a lot of the new shares in sales because a lot of grandpas learn how to buy toilet paper online. But at the same time, retail is benefiting from the enormous surge in retail sales. So in a sense, the retail problem has been buoyed in part by this big boom in retail sales, but we all got to keep in mind that the back end of this thing, sales have to get back to some normal level and these problems come back. We have too much retail space. We have too much. Gavin Newsom and Governor, they keep trying to come up with these weird things about accelerator units. I still have, I think, the best idea for fixing our housing problem in California, which is to permanently rezone any retail zone space in the entire state, mixed use retail residential. It would fix all sorts of problems. Never going to happen, but I think it's a brilliant idea. As for office, yet again, really interesting. We heard again the apocalyptic nonsense like, oh, people are never going to work downtown again. Of course, that's nonsensical. But the work from home thing is interesting. And the way to think about work from home is this way. They did a survey of CEOs, the Atlanta Fed did, very, very good survey. Prior to the pandemic, about 10% of all office days were work from home. According to the survey of CEOs afterwards, they expect about 30%. Now, the interesting conversation about this is, it isn't that, oh, we don't really need office anymore. We still need offices. I think we learned that. But we also learned that people can work from home. My company's a classic example. I've had people work from home. It's never quite worked. This time we had to make everybody do it. We put systems in place and people did great. And indeed, a lot of the surveys show on the left-hand side that about a third of the time people spend commuting, they actually gave over to working. So in theory, you might actually be getting better productivity out of your folks. They may be more distracted at home by the TV, but of course at the office, they're more distracted by the coworkers, right? The real issue here, the real interesting is on the right-hand side. This is a wonderful survey. They asked people, how many days per week do you want to work? And what's interesting is a third of the people said never. I want to work from home all the time. And a third of the people said, I never want to work from home. And this is what employers are realizing. Oh, wow, I have two populations and they both want different things. And by the way, my running joke on this is the people who never wanted to work from home. I say, well, I was supposed to be the ones with kids. Well, that's maybe a cute joke, but I should back up that it's absolutely wrong. I was talking to some folks who do these surveys, and actually it's the people who have kids who want to work from home and the young people who don't have kids who don't want to be stuck at the house. Now, this is critical. We're going to come in a second. Remember, In San Jose, California, and now the nation has a worker shortage. And that means you're going to have to, at some level, work with people. So if you think you're going to be cutesy and never have an office, a third of your people are going to quit. If you're going to tell people they have to come back, a third of them are going to quit. Get used to it. This is the new world. Now, with all this good news, spending's on fire, everything's great, commercial's fine. Where are the jobs, right? And this is the big issue. Every time you pick up a paper, every time someone wants to tell us how tragic things still are, they bring up the fact that there are 6 million fewer jobs today than there were before the pandemic. Now, I agree with that number, 6 million jobs fewer, but employment numbers are in equilibrium. It's a function of labor demand and labor supply. The inherent sort of knee-jerk reaction from people is, oh, there's 6 million fewer jobs. Oh, that means there's 6 million people out there about to starve. There must be a problem with labor demand. Maybe, certainly there were fewer jobs in the US in 2011 than there were in 2006 because of that problem. But I would point out that the unemployment rates, that this is August, I need to update with September, is 5%. That doesn't sound to me like 6 million people are starving. And indeed, remember, it couldn't be labor demand, but it could equally be labor supply. Oh, by the way, did you hear about the 11 million job openings? That's the real deal. And excuse me, it isn't just that there are 11 million job openings. Context is important here. Before the pandemic, when the economy was great, there were 7.5 million job openings. There are half again as many job openings today as there were 2 years ago. That's not a labor demand problem. That's a labor supply problem. Whereas the labor supply problem, well, there's 3 million fewer workers today than there were pre-pandemic. Now, again, the knee-jerk reaction is, oh, those are discouraged workers. No, they're not. No, they're not. And remember, let's go back to, capacity, right? Because this whole conversation is about inventories, if you will. Remember when I talked about 2 years ago? We have a labor shortage problem in the United States. The boomers are retiring. They didn't have enough kids. Immigration is down. Even coming into the pandemic, the number of people in their prime working years was in negative territory. People between 25 and 64 were declining in the United States. So we had a labor problem. Now, we didn't feel too acute because as things got tight, when we had the 3.5% unemployment rate, wages were going up and people were just kind of staying in the workforce. They were. Participation rates were rising, even though they should have been falling, controlling for demographics. People were just, well, I'll stick around. Well, you get to the pandemic, you take a month off and, this is kind of cool. I think that's what happened to Mark, isn't it? He took a month off and realized, screw this, right? But it's not just Mr. Parkinson, who we all miss. 2.5 million people retired in the last year. 2.5 million people. This is not unemployment. Oh, unemployment is making people sit at home on the couch, making people not want to work. It's unbelievable. Look, 2.5 million people retired. I get it. They're at the top of the food chain. But when a senior guy retires, the junior senior guy has to go up, and then the senior junior guy goes up, and then the junior guy goes up, and then the senior entry level guy goes up, and boom, everybody gets pulled up. And yeah, it's the jobs at the bottom end that aren't getting filled. That's exactly where this country is. We can't fill these jobs because we don't have the people to fill them. And you can see it in the wage numbers. We never saw a decline in earnings growth. We all heard about the K-shaped recovery. There was no wage recession in the first place to have a K-shaped recovery to recover from. Earnings kept growing. Right now, the greatest pay increases in the United States are by people in their bottom quartile. If you are worried about inequality, the solution has arrived. Massive labor shortages. California, we have not recovered as much as the rest of the United States. But again, I challenge you to walk down any street in this state and not see at least 3 help wanted signs. Same thing in the San Jose. The jobs are still down, but look, tech, professional, they're up, they're doing great. But good luck trying to repopulate your labor force in your restaurants, because all the folks that have been working there a year and a half ago have a job someplace else. So yeah, we have a real problem with labor shortages, and that's what's happening in the economy. Look at the unemployment rate. It's 4% in San Jose. You're down a lot of jobs with a 4% unemployment rate. And of course, in California, everywhere, suddenly the new watchword, the new form of economic development no longer is about job attraction. It's now about labor force attraction. Simple as that. Economies that are going to grow over the next decade are the ones that can attract people. We attract a lot of people because we live in one of the nicest places on the planet. The problem is we don't build housing for them. Talked about this. And permits, despite all the promises, haven't budged a bit. We just keep cruising at the same level. San Jose, they're coming up just a little bit, but still vastly too low. And again, ultimately, if you don't build housing, people cannot move here. It's as simple as that. We continue to see out-migration to the rest of the United States. These are primarily lower income families leaving because they simply can't compete in the ferocious bidding war for housing in California. And if you're an employer here, this is the impact. On the right-hand side, for all the big increases in earnings in the United States overall, they're accelerated here because, again, of labor shortages. Again, if you're worried about inequality, if you're worried about low-income families, the next 5-6 years are going to be a period of renaissance for people who maybe 15 years ago really didn't have an opportunity. But if you're trying to run a business, it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough. It's as simple as that. Now, how long can this all go? Well, this all goes back to the conversation about the overstimulation of the economy. It all sounds good up till now, but remember, all the heat in the economy is based on this excessive overreaction of government. The federal government, $5 trillion. And I won't go into the nonsense about the PPP and this. I mean, the checks they sent to people, 110, 115 million people got subsidies from the federal government. 90% of those, 95% of those people, their problem was they couldn't spend money. Giving people money they can't spend is not stimulus. It doesn't do any good in the short run. But of course, what it does do is makes people really wealthy. And that's exactly what's occurred. And it isn't just that they gave everybody the money, they gave everybody so much money. On the right-hand side, the green line is actual spending on the part of the household. Took a big hit, right? We were all stuck at home. We couldn't spend any money. The blue line's compensation. Compensation didn't go down by much at all. Had you not had any major government reaction to this thing, you would have had a buildup in savings because spending dropped more than earnings did. But of course, they got involved. And for every dollar of lost earnings in the US, for every dollar of lost earnings, the federal government gave us back $3.50, 3.5 to 1 replacement rate. Again, people saved it. They paid down debt. They bought non-essentials. They donated it. That's very nice. But we're doing all these wonderful things on the basis of a massive increase in the federal debt that our children and grandchildren are going to have to pay back. The numbers are crazy. 6.5 trillion in excess savings, 3.5 trillion in excess deposits. You wonder why the stock market has the second highest PE ratio and keeps going up, 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 because there's so much money floating around. Take a look on the left-hand side. This is year-over-year increase in the aggregate household net worth in the United States. It goes back to 1970. Even in the run-up to the big stock market boom, right? You never saw anything like this. 23% increase in household net worth in 1 year. In 2 years, American households have seen a 25% increase in their net worth. That represents $30 trillion in new wealth that just materially appeared in the United States. But again, on the basis of what? Fiscal and monetary policy. Look, we have the lowest financial obligations ratio ever. We all refied our homes at 2.7%. No, you weren't the only genius. We all did it. Consumer credit markets are absolutely wonderful. At what cost? All this comes from federal debt. you know, from 2014 to 2019, in the midst of a healthy economy, a healthy expansion, we picked up about 4 trillion. And then in the next 2 years, we picked up another 6 trillion, right? In the last 20, in 2000, this nation had a 55% gross debt to GDP. Today, it's 130%. We've doubled our debt to GDP ratio in the last 20 years, candidly, in one of the most prosperous periods in US economic history. And all we can do is sit around and feel bad for ourselves. Of course, it wasn't just Congress. Mr. Powell cut the federal funds rate to zero and, tossed $4 trillion in quantitative easing out there because, this is a big crisis. That's more than what Ben Bernanke and Janet Yellen did. They did about 3 trillion, a little about 3.2, 3.3 trillion in quantitative easing. By the way, that was over about 4 or 5 years. And one would ask, well, let's talk about Jerome Powell versus Yellen and what's the name there? They were fighting one of the most serious financial crises this nation had faced since 1929. Deflationary pressures, collapse on wealth, massive increases in bank delinquencies, bank balance sheets being destroyed, massive hedge funds going under in Wall Street. What's this guy facing? There are no problems in the banking system. Debt delinquencies haven't budged. They're down for consumer debt. Americans have almost 30 trillion in new debt income, new wealth in the last 2 years. What are you doing? But it's amazing. Nobody talks about this. They can only talk about how terrible things are and how he's got to do it just to keep the economy alive. And lo and behold, prices are going up. Now, you know the numbers, commodity prices up 20%, energy prices through the roof. Powell keeps telling us, well, it's because of the supply chain effects. And I actually agree with that. Look, they boosted the hell out of consumer demand and the system wasn't ready for it. And yet spilling through, there's no doubt about it. By the way, on that front, again, we can't get rid of miserableism, right? I had a reporter call me the other day, oh, this inflation's terrible for consumers, right? I mean, real earnings are going down. And I go, dude, consumers are causing inflation. Inflation isn't hurting consumers. It's this excessive demand that's pushing this. But putting it to one side, that's not the question. The question is what about real inflation, structural inflation? Well, Powell keeps sort of indicating that because it's a supply chain effect, structural inflation isn't a problem. Sir, I beg to differ. I beg to differ. Look, what causes inflation? 2 things, too much money and too much demand. Go back to the 1970s. We had a lot of money. That's unit money supply. It's basically M2 divided by nominal GDP. Very high in the 70s. Now that by itself doesn't cause inflation, but then you had a whole bunch of a deficit spending on the Vietnam War. Bam, we had inflation. And then you had the first oil shock, which kind of was, I know it kind of hurt the economy, but at the same time, it was a nominal demand hit to the economy. And because we had all that money, bam, it created inflation. And then you had all the stimulus and bam, we had more inflation. So finally, Volcker comes in, we got to fix inflation, shrinks the money supply and conquers it, finally gets rid of it, setting off a nasty recession. Now you go all these years, money supply is nice and low. It had been rising. Look at the Janet Yellen, Ben Bernanke years. No increase, same trend. It was increasing, but same trend. They basically offset what they needed to keep things steady. This guy comes in, boom, we've never seen this much of an increase in the money supply in such a short period of time. For him to stand there and tell us inflation's not a risk is something between total ignorance and total gaslighting. I don't know which one it is. And I apologize if those sound like harsh words, but let's keep something in mind. Policy is not driven by economics. And as an economist, that hurts me to the core. But it's important for us to realize that policy is driven by narratives. And over the last decade, the narrative we've taught ourselves is a narrative of decline, a narrative of decay, a narrative of an economy on the brink of absolute collapse, even though there's just really, as noted, not really any particular reason to think that. Now, the Federal Reserve is not supposed to be swayed by political narratives. They're supposed to be swayed by economic realities. But look at who the Federal Reserve Board is now. They're politicians. The chairman, Jerome Powell, is a lawyer. Now, I don't have a problem with lawyers per se, but I wouldn't want one giving me a root canal. And I'm not sure why I particularly want one running the Federal Reserve. And he's responding as a politician to the narrative, not the reality. And yeah, this is really scary. And I'll tell you why. Here's where this goes. Look, at some point in time, the federal debt becomes too much. At some point in time, our structural, our supply chain inflation becomes real inflation. And at that point in time, interest rates finally start to go up. Not yet, because bond markets are reactive. They're not proactive. They listen to whatever the Fed chairman tells them, because that gives them cover. In the meantime, they could just keep placing the money. But eventually, you can't ignore it anymore. Interest rates start to go up. And that's where it gets ugly, because look on the right-hand side. Why aren't we talking about the fact that we doubled debt to GDP? Well, it's because the cost of that debt hasn't budged. It's been 2.5% pretty much consistently because of the decline in interest rates. Now, what happens when interest rates go up again? Well, suddenly, this debt becomes very expensive very quickly, even in the face of an already very high debt level and expanding payments of Medicare and Social Security. And at some point in time, the bond markets start to bulk. Some point in time, we start hitting a wall. You have a tight money supply and a fiscal pullback, and that's a recipe for a recession. And depending on how dramatic it is, how rapidly it occurs, it could be a very nasty recession. But it's too early to call it. It's clear the risks are there. In the meantime, the short run, economy's on fire. The V was the only logical outcome. The V is exactly what's happening. GDP hasn't caught up, but it's not because they don't want to. Aggregate demand in this economy is enormous. $28 trillion in new household wealth generated in 2 years. That's going to push this economy forward. The only thing holding the back is supply chains. New roaring 20s until at some point in time, the sugar high has to go away. Some point in time, they're going to have to start tightening up in the money supply. At some point in time, they're going to have to do something about the federal deficit. Now, how ugly does this get? I don't have an answer for that because it's too early. If the policymakers start backing off early, maybe it won't be that big of a deal. But if they don't, if they continue it, if they're not willing to make the political choices they need to make, if the private sector starts getting involved and they start this time over investing on the basis of potential growth that isn't there, then it gets ugly. The way to think about this is the quicker this comes to an end, the better off we're going to be. Could be 2 years, could be 7 years. If it's 2 years, not going to be a big deal. If it's 7 years, could be really nasty. We just don't know. In the meantime, whatever you're hearing me, next couple of years, you're going to make money. Labor supply, it's good for workers, bad for businesses. Get used to it. As for California, it only brings back my ongoing conversation. The only thing this state needs to do for economic development boils down to one word: housing. Policy thoughts? Please, Sacramento. Please, Washington, D.C. Take off the crisis hat. Let's refocus on the long run. We need immigration policy. Yeah, we need infrastructure. We need to fix the federal budget. Of all the stuff in this infrastructure bill, that's now just got passed. Looks like we're gonna have a deal now. Of all the things in there, you could point to some of the infrastructure up and and point a finger at it, but I will tell everybody on this call, the one thing in that infrastructure bill that makes sense is pre-K education. Europe is way ahead of us on the labor shortage issue. They've invested in pre-K, they've invested in childcare, and as a result of that, the female participation rate in Europe is significantly higher than it is here. Fixes a lot of problems. It's an enormous MPV for those kids, for those families, and for businesses. I'd give up a lot of roads and bridges and trains for a permanent pre-K system, and you probably ought to be behind that as well. As for growth in your neck of the woods, the growth for the next 10 years, workforce of tomorrow. Where those young techies move is where you're going to continue to see success. They're moving to San Jose, and because there's a lot of opportunity for them, but they're squeezing the rest of the economy out. Be curious to know one point in time when there's no more other economy to squeeze out, and then we have to ask, will Silicon Valley finally have to hand over the mantle to someplace else? Easy solution, build more housing. And with that, happy Halloween. This is our little trip to Not Spooky Farm the other day. Yes, that is me. And with that, before anybody can blackmail me, I will go on to my last slide, and let's see if we have some questions.
All righty, so we have a total of 3 questions. The first one is, what is the impact of AB 9 and 10 on the housing market in the Bay Area?
AB 9 and 10 year, someone's going to have to help me out here. I'm not good at that stuff. Hang on, I'm looking at my phone. I know these. What are they? AB 9. I'm sorry. I got to go figure out what those are. Who asked the question? Can you unmute and just tell me what you're talking about?
Yes, Lawrence Robin.
I did. AB 9 and 10 are the ones where the cities no longer control housing. The state says,
yeah,
right?
Yeah. Well, look, I don't think, did they actually pass them?
Yes.
They did pass them. Okay, yeah. The one that I'm trying to remember the things on these, but the one that made I know was probably the biggest hit was the one where you got rid of the R1s and now you could go up to 4 units. And there's a lot of hope on that, but there's still a lot of local control involved, right? There's still a lot of local control because as much as the state tries to bend the rules, the problem is that there's local resistance to housing. There just is. And they keep trying to push and cajole and prod and whip these cities to building housing. You can't do that because they're going to find ways of pushing back. What you have to do here is positively incentivize them to want housing. And that means changing the local tax system. Local governments make lots of money on business and no money on housing. So everybody's hoping that you'll build the housing so they can have all the jobs. You got to shift that formula if you really want to make this work. Simple as that, you know, simple as that.
All righty, and the next question is also from the same gentleman. Are we at the end of the bull market that started in 2009 or at the start of a new bull market?
Oh, this thing's we got a couple of years. Everything's on fire. The economy's on fire, right? There's $28 trillion in new money sitting out there. Again, built on fumes, built on $4 trillion in quantitative easing, $5 trillion in government borrowing, but it's there. And you know, it's good. The economy's going to rocket while that money's there. So, you know, I go back to what I said at the beginning of this thing. In 2004 and 5, I was worried about the economy, but the worries I saw, the risks I saw were building up in the private sector. And then in 06 and 07, it became palpable. And it finally blew up. This time around, I feel like we're in 2002 again. But as opposed to seeing 2000, as opposed to seeing, if you will, the beginnings of really dangerous trends in subprime lending and wondering where that's going to go, now the incredibly dangerous trends are the trends of the Federal Reserve and the federal government. They're the centers of the risk. They're the centers of what's happening. So again, nothing I'm saying here is go hide in your bunker now, but don't get far away from it either. I guess is the best way I could put it.
Alrighty. Will evictions result in new inventory coming onto the market?
There's no evictions. There's no evictions. The vast majority of non-payment in the state is non-payment by people who decided to not pay because you can't throw them out. The problems are not that, just not that. There aren't these big giant eviction problems. There just aren't. It's a complete myth. And it's amazing. And we can't let it go. Newspapers keep talking about it, even though they can't find evidence of it. It goes back to the power of the narrative, the power of the story. We hear and believe what we want to believe, even if all the data keeps screaming at us, giant red lights. This is not the issue.
Next question. Can we get your take on the Federal Reserve Board? And if we do, will you still come back to speak with us?
I think I kind of gave you my take on it, right? They're politicians and they're behaving politically. And, you know, I'm not even saying that, you know, it's easy to take that comment as being snide. Oh, a politician, you know, it's not. Look, I've been talking about this book too much, but Robert Schiller wrote a wonderful book in the last year called Narrative Economics. And he talks about the power of the narrative and how economists have in many cases, we sort of just kind of assume because people are rational that the narrative follows the data. But if you look at reality, that's not how the world works. In narratives, it can take trajectories in different ways. And that's because most people don't think about data the way I do. They think about the world in different ways. And to be clear, even as an economist who's trained in data science, what do? I make a regression. I pick up the regression. I look at all these numbers on the page and I tell myself a story. This is what this regression tells me. Now, you have to pay attention to the story, particularly in this world, because stories are becoming derailed because of social media. And if you don't believe it, I would ask you to go rewatch the videos of January 6th. Narratives are powerful and they're going in weird places. And what we all have to do is try and take a step back and try to, if you will, get people to understand that there are other narratives out there, narratives that may have a different connotation. There are different ways of thinking about the world, but it's so hard to move that. Today, we got a 2% GDP. The narrative is the recovery slowing down. Or the narrative on the right is because of Biden's terrible policies. And really the narrative is people couldn't find new cars to buy. So we all have to be part of making this public narrative something a little closer to the truth and pushing back on these crazy things that are happening in social media world.
Okay, next question is, what is the international perspective?
Well, look, they're in some ways less overstimulated. Europe, the UK did too much stimulus, but they didn't quite overdo it the way we did. And by the way, they also hammered their economies a little harder than we did too. So in a sense, the rest of the world's coming out of this. They're probably going to have what I would call a more normal recovery from a natural disaster trajectory. The US really is probably the most overheated, overstimulated economy in the world right now. And China, by the way, is laughing all the way to the bank. You think about the fact that demand is back to long-run trend, supply is behind. Our trade deficit has absolutely exploded in the last year and a half, and you know who's benefiting, right?
Next question. Would you comment on the environmental damage and climate change with overproduction and consumption?
Couldn't agree more, right? We haven't fully grasped climate change. We're not doing what we need to be doing, right? Why? Well, I mean, again, there's a whole narrative out there. Oh, this is all hocus pocus, fake stuff driven by communist professors and Chinese conspiracy guys. I don't know. No, it's the real deal. Well, if you wean us off of fossil fuels, the economy is never going to work again. Or even 2 years ago, oh, robots are going to take our jobs. So bring on the robots, people, right? Climate change is something we need to deal with, and we're just not tackling it. Now, with that in mind, yeah, this big surge in consumption is coming at a cost to the environment. Coal consumption is going through the roof. Now, I'd like, again, some of this new infrastructure bill, they're going to put, looks like 500 billion more into green energy. It's helping. We know there's a lot of good changes out there. I think we can get down this path pretty good with some of the effectiveness, some of the technologies out there. But we have to be, we continue to waste money building light rail. If we took all the money we were pissing away on light rail, which is going to be useless in 15 years, and put it into truly developing self-driving cars, think how that would help the environment. And by the way, if we would get over this preposterous fear of nuclear energy, yet again, we wouldn't need all that coal and natural gas, people. We're our own worst enemies. The narrative, nuclear is dangerous. That was nuclear built in 1964 when they didn't have computers. It's a different world, people. Why am I getting off topic here, Brent?
No, not at all. I'm right with you on that one. If you want to solve the climate crisis, man, and you want to do it fast, you go nuclear. It's very simple. Very simple.
It's just anyway. Let's do like one more. I know it's 6 o'clock. I'm sure people want to get back to that bottle of wine. Brent's already into it. So
Sure thing. If we have a labor and housing problem, why not incentivize companies to move to low-cost areas of California?
they are. There's no housing there either. Right? Look, let's be clear. First of all, where companies go is not just a function of, I'm going to go to any empty field that's cheap. We have downtowns in the world. Some of the most important things that have happened in these dense job zones. Economists have always said, look, downtowns exist for a reason. They're expensive, they're hard to get to, and there's these huge cluster of high-end jobs there. So downtowns are important, even if they're expensive. And if you need to be in a downtown, if you need to be in that kind of environment, you just can't move operations to Fresno. Doesn't matter what the cost of housing is out there. It's not realistic. And that's exactly the issue you're talking about, right? Phoenix has more jobs now than it did a year and a half ago. Phoenix has the fastest growing major city in this nation. The primary reason that Phoenix is growing is they build and people want to go there. They have the combination of a liquid housing market with a very good job market, and the area is booming. You know what? And the thing is you could do this without destroying the pristine nature of California. The problem is nobody wants to be that neighborhood. But the reality is you take one or two small cities, and just for the sake of argument, we're not even going to name names, but somewhere between Santa Clara and up to San Francisco, you look at a couple of those cities, and let's just say for the sake of argument, you went in there and you said, look, you got all these single family homes, all you guys got to move. We're tearing this all down. We're building a brand new plan. We're putting everything from 10 to 70-story buildings in here. We're going to have schools. We're going to have shopping. We're going to have office buildings. Boom. Giant master plan, high density community. Everybody can get around in electric trolleys. That place would fill up because you live in one of the best places on the planet and people want to be here. Problem is what two cities are going to volunteer to do that? This is a choice. And until we're willing to accept some change, this situation is only going to get worse. I don't mean leave California, but if you're not in those high income industries or the service industries that take care of them, it's going to be a tough place to do business. Tesla is not moving to Austin. because he doesn't like California. He's moving to Austin because you can't do an auto company in the Bay Area anymore. It's as simple as that. All right, folks, go out, have a couple good years. Next year, we're all going to get wasted in Rinconada, and this is going to be a lot more fun. So with that, thank you all, and I'll turn it back over to Ed, and happy
Thank you,
Halloween.
Chris. Always informative and entertaining. So we appreciate your insights, and it'll be interesting to see how things roll based on the information you've given us. And next year, in person, wine glass on me at La Rinconada. So hopefully we can do that. On behalf of all the partners of Petronovich Fueling Company and Rich and Brent and Legacy Capital Group, thank you for joining us. We hope you got a lot of good information out of this, and we look forward to talking with you soon. Take care, everybody.